My name is Daniel. I'm in my mid-30s, and for most of my adult life, I've worked behind the scenes. Product strategy, process design, the kind of work that only gets noticed when it fails. People usually describe me as calm, reliable, low ego, the kind of person who doesn't need the spotlight. What they often mean is that I'm easy to overlook. I've learned that when you speak carefully, listen more than you talk, and deliver results without attaching your identity to them, people fill in the blanks for you. They decide who you are. In my case, they decided I was safe, useful, quiet, not someone who would push back. This is the story of my boss took credit for my $120,000 project, then fired me. It's also the story behind a sentence that followed me for a long time afterward. He thought silence meant weakness. He was wrong. I want to be clear about what this story is not. It's not a revenge fantasy. There's no shouting match, no viral meltdown, no moment where everyone claps. I didn't win the lottery. I didn't suddenly become someone else. What happened unfolded slowly, almost invisibly, through choices most people would have mistaken for restraint. At the center of this story is a project, one that reshaped how a mid-sized company operated and generated just over $120,000 in measurable value within its first year. I built it quietly, the way I built everything, documenting risks, aligning teams, fixing problems before they had names. When it succeeded, I assumed the work would speak for itself. Instead, something else spoke louder. Over the course of months, I watched my contributions slowly rewritten, first in meetings, then in presentations, then in narratives told above my pay grade. By the time the project was being celebrated publicly, my name had vanished from it. Not erased violently, just gently edited out. And then I was fired. What follows is not a tale about how to destroy someone who wronged you. It's about what happens when you stop correcting people who underestimate you and start observing what they reveal instead. It's about patience without passivity, silence without surrender, about understanding leverage before you ever need to use it. This story moves through discomfort, self-doubt, and a long stretch where nothing appears to happen at all. But beneath that stillness, decisions were being made, records kept, doors quietly opened and closed. By the time anyone realized the ground had shifted, it was already too late to put it back. I'm telling this now not to make myself look clever, and not to paint anyone else as a cartoon villain. Everyone in this story behaved like very normal people do, protecting status, avoiding blame, choosing convenience over fairness, including me. So before we go any further, let me ask you something. Have you ever stayed silent, not because you were afraid to speak, but because you were still deciding whether the truth needed your voice at all? To them, I was dependable in the way furniture is dependable. I showed up early, left on time, and rarely drew attention to myself. I spoke when I had something concrete to add, not to fill the silence. In meetings, I was the one people turned to when something broke, not to explain why it broke, but to quietly fix it. That became my reputation, the fixer, the stabilizer, the person you loop in after decisions are already made. No one ever said it directly, but I understood my place. I wasn't the visionary. I wasn't leadership material. I was the one who translated other people's ideas into systems that actually worked. And because I did that well, consistently, calmly, it stopped being remarkable. It became expected. At performance reviews, the language was always the same. Rock solid, low maintenance, always delivers. They meant it as praise. But praise that never evolves is just a ceiling disguised as a compliment. In group settings, I was often talked over, not aggressively, just efficiently. Someone more senior would restate an idea I had just explained, slightly louder, slightly more confident, and the room would nod. I learned early that correcting this in real time made me look insecure. So I didn't. I told myself it didn't matter, the work mattered. And for a long time, that felt true. My boss, Mark was charismatic in a way that executives love. He spoke in clean narratives, had an instinct for credit, and understood exactly how much confidence to project without inviting scrutiny. He didn't micromanage me, which I initially appreciated. He trusted me to handle things. Over time, I realized that trust came with invisibility. As long as results appeared, he didn't ask how. I was often excluded from early stage conversations about projects I would later be responsible for executing. Decisions would arrive already framed, and my job was to make them viable. I learned to read between the lines. My value was operational, not strategic. Useful, not influential. What's important here is this: I didn't experience this as cruelty. There were no insults, no raised voices, no explicit disrespect. That's why it took me so long to recognize it for what it was. Everything happened politely, casually, with plausible deniability. If someone had asked me then whether I felt undervalued, I would have said no. I had a good salary, reasonable hours, a manager who let me do my thing. Compared to the chaos I saw in other departments, my situation looked stable. But stability can be deceptive. In hindsight, I see that I was being assessed constantly, not for growth, but for compliance. How much could I carry without complaint? How reliably would I absorb pressure so others didn't have to? Each time I stayed quiet, each time I smoothed over a problem without escalating it, I was reinforcing an image. Daniel can handle it. Daniel doesn't need acknowledgement. Daniel won't make this political. That image followed me everywhere. When new hires joined, they were told to come to me if they needed help understanding processes. Not because I had authority, but because I was safe. I wouldn't judge. I wouldn't escalate. I wouldn't take credit. I became a buffer between chaos and leadership, and buffers are rarely noticed unless they fail. There's a specific kind of invisibility that comes from being competent without being loud. You're not ignored, you're assumed. Your effort becomes part of the background noise of success. And once that happens, people stop asking who's carrying the weight. They just keep adding more. I didn't resent this. Not at first. I told myself that real influence didn't need an audience, that eventually results would speak louder than positioning, that someone would notice the pattern. What I didn't realize was that patterns are only visible to those who benefit from seeing them. Everyone else just enjoys the outcome. So to them, I was steady, replaceable, but not urgent, valuable, but not central. The kind of employee you think you understand completely because he's never challenged your understanding. And the most dangerous thing about that perception? Once people think they have you figured out, they stop imagining what you might do differently. The first time it happened, it was so minor that I almost dismissed it myself. We were in a weekly leadership sync, nothing formal, just department heads and a few senior contributors. I had spent the previous 3 weeks redesigning a workflow that was quietly bleeding money. Vendor delays, duplicated approvals, missed handoffs, the kind of inefficiency that never shows up as a single problem, just a constant drag. I didn't announce the work. I documented it, built a model, ran scenarios. Then I sent Mark a concise brief with recommendations and a pilot plan. He replied with a thumbs-up emoji and "Let's discuss in sync." In the meeting, Mark walked everyone through the solution. Not my solution, just the solution. He used my framework almost verbatim, the same sequence, the same language, even the same example I'd used to illustrate risk reduction. I remember noticing it the way you notice a familiar song playing in another room. Recognizable, but slightly distorted. No credit was given, not to me, not to anyone. At the end, the VP nodded and said, "Good thinking, Mark. This is exactly the kind of proactive leadership we need." I felt a brief, sharp pause inside my chest. Not anger, more like disorientation. I waited for Mark to add, "Daniel did the analysis," or "My team put this together." He didn't. He just smiled and said, "Happy to take this forward." The meeting moved on. Afterward, I sat at my desk and replayed it. I told myself I was overreacting, that this was how management worked, that leaders present ideas on behalf of their teams. That credit is implied. I reminded myself that the project hadn't even launched yet. Plenty of time for acknowledgement later. That's the thing about the first small cut. It doesn't bleed enough to justify stopping. A few weeks later, the pilot results came in. The numbers were solid, better than projected. Reduced turnaround time, fewer escalations, actual savings. I sent Mark a detailed report, including next steps and risk flags. This time he forwarded it up the chain, except my name wasn't on it. The document had been lightly edited, tone softened, a few headers changed, but the substance was the same. I only knew because I recognized my own phrasing. I had a habit of structuring bullet points in a specific rhythm, short, precise, almost symmetrical. Seeing it without my name attached felt strange, like seeing your reflection in a window and realizing it's not you. Still, I said nothing. Not because I was afraid, but because I didn't yet know what the right response was. Calling it out felt petty. Escalating felt disproportionate. And part of me still believed this was temporary, that once the project scaled, once it became visible, attribution would naturally follow. In the meantime, Mark started referencing his initiative more openly, not in a boastful way, just casually. When I designed this process, what I realized early on, always said with a tone of collective ownership, but phrased as individual insight, no one challenged it. Why would they? From their perspective, it made sense. He was the manager, I was the implementer. The discomfort grew quietly. I noticed it in how people spoke to me after meetings. Less curiosity, more instruction. As if I were now supporting his work, not leading my own. When questions arose about the system, they went to Mark first. He would then forward them to me, sometimes with added context that subtly reframed my role. Daniel can help clarify the details. Details. That word lingered. I started to realize that this wasn't about a single moment of missed credit. It was about narrative. And narrative, once established, has momentum. The earlier you intervene, the easier it is to correct. The longer you wait, the more it feels like you're rewriting history. But I still waited, because the cut was small, clean, easy to ignore. And like most people who take pride in being reasonable, I didn't want to be the one who made it a thing. I told myself that staying quiet was professionalism. I didn't yet understand that staying quiet was also data for them. What begins as an exception has a way of becoming precedent. After that first project, the pattern didn't escalate dramatically. It settled in, quietly, comfortably. Mark continued to present work I led as if it were a natural extension of his role. Sometimes he'd say we, sometimes my team, but never my name. And because I didn't correct it the first time, there was now an unspoken agreement that this was acceptable. I adjusted my expectations instead of my behavior. When recognition didn't come, I told myself it wasn't the point. When my scope expanded without a corresponding change in title or authority, I framed it as trust. When my calendar filled with cross-functional requests that technically weren't my responsibility, I said yes, because saying no felt like friction, and friction felt risky. There's a particular rationalization that high-performing, quiet people fall into. If I keep delivering, eventually someone will notice. It sounds humble, mature. It's also dangerously passive. Meetings became more performative. I'd prepare detailed analyses, but only Mark would speak. If I added context, he'd nod and rephrase it immediately, as if translating my input into executive language. I watched others take notes while he spoke, unaware they were writing down my thinking. At first, I felt proud of the influence, then I felt erased by it. What made it harder was the absence of hostility. Mark wasn't cruel. He didn't belittle me. In one-on-ones, he was cordial, even appreciative, always in private. "Couldn't do this without you," he'd say. "You're such a steady presence. I trust you more than anyone on the team." Those statements are disarming. They create a sense of loyalty without protection. They make you feel seen while keeping you out of view. Over time, I noticed how others mirrored his behavior. Stakeholders began bypassing me for strategic discussions, looping me in only when execution was needed. Junior colleagues assumed I was there to support, not lead. When someone thanked Mark for the success of a rollout I'd managed end to end, he'd smile, and the room would move on, and I would move on with it. The most subtle shift was internal. I stopped expecting fairness. I started budgeting for disappointment. That adjustment felt like maturity at the time. In reality, it was an accommodation. I told myself stories to stay comfortable. This is just how corporate life works. Recognition is political. I'm above that. I don't want his job anyway. Stability matters more than ego. Each story made it easier to stay quiet, but silence, repeated, teaches people how to treat you. Not because they're malicious, but because humans optimize for the path of least resistance. If taking credit carries no cost, it becomes a habit. If someone else absorbs the labor without complaint, the system adjusts accordingly. I began to see myself the way they saw me, as infrastructure, necessary but not visible, reliable but not promotable, the kind of person you lean on, not the kind you lift up. The irony is that I was more capable than ever. My understanding of the business had deepened. I knew where the inefficiencies were, which relationships mattered, which metrics were quietly manipulated to tell a better story. I had access, context, and trust across departments. But none of that translated into narrative power. One afternoon, a newer hire asked me a question that landed harder than he intended. He'd been tasked with documenting the origin of the new workflow. "So," he said casually, "did Mark come up with this, or was it more of a team thing?" I hesitated. There was a moment, small but loaded, where I could have corrected the record, explained my role, reclaimed the truth. Instead, I smiled and said, "It was collaborative." He nodded, satisfied, and walked away. That was the moment I realized something uncomfortable. I had started protecting the story that diminished me, not because I believed in it, but because challenging it felt harder than living with it. Disrespect doesn't always arrive as an attack. Sometimes it arrives as an assumption, and the longer it goes unchallenged, the more normal it feels. By then, the pattern was set. My silence had become part of the structure. And structures, once built, don't collapse on their own. They require a shift. At the time, I didn't know what that shift would be. I only knew that something about the role I was playing no longer matched who I was becoming. Roles don't always come with titles. Sometimes they arrive as expectations, quiet, unspoken, reinforced over time until stepping outside them feels like a violation. By the time the second quarter ended, I understood exactly who I was supposed to be. I was the stabilizer, the person who absorbed complexity so others could appear decisive. When deadlines were unrealistic, I adjusted. When priorities conflicted, I negotiated quietly behind the scenes. When something went wrong, I fixed it before it reached the surface. I wasn't asked to do these things. I was relied on to do them. The clearer this became, the more I noticed how the organization subtly protected the people above me from accountability. If a project succeeded, it validated leadership. If it struggled, it became an execution issue. And execution lived with me. Mark's role was to think big and communicate confidence. My role was to make sure reality didn't contradict him. That division worked until it didn't. I remember a planning session where a senior director questioned a timeline Mark had proposed. The numbers didn't add up. I knew it. Mark knew it. But instead of addressing the concern directly, he looked at me and said, "Daniel can probably make that work, right?" Everyone turned toward me. That was the role, distilled into a single moment. I could have said no. I could have explained the constraints. But I also knew what would happen if I did. The room would grow tense. Mark would feel exposed. The director would lose confidence, not in the plan, but in the team's alignment. And I would be seen as the friction point. So I said, "I'll see what's possible." The meeting moved on. Afterward, Mark thanked me for having his back. It was meant sincerely. But what it really meant was that I had once again accepted responsibility without authority. I was the one who would have to reconcile the impossible ask. If it worked, great. If it didn't, the failure would quietly land on my desk. That pattern repeated itself in different forms. I was looped into late-stage fixes, last-minute pivots, and damage control, rarely into vision setting or credit sharing. What struck me most was how comfortable everyone seemed with this arrangement, including me. There's a false nobility in being the reliable one. It feels virtuous to carry weight without complaint, to be the adult in the room, to prioritize outcomes over ego. But over time, that posture becomes a trap, because once people assign you the role of the one who handles things, they stop imagining you as the one who leads them. I wasn't being groomed for advancement. I was being positioned as support. And the more I accepted that, the more invisible my ambition became, even to myself. I noticed how my ideas were received differently depending on who voiced them. If I sent a thoughtful proposal by email, it might get a polite acknowledgement. If Mark summarized the same idea verbally in a meeting, it sparked discussion. Not because it was better, but because it came from the right mouth. I started to understand that competence alone doesn't shift roles. Perception does. And perception, once set, resists change. The most telling sign came during a reorganization discussion. There was talk of creating a new leadership role, one that aligned almost perfectly with the work I'd been doing. Cross-functional oversight, process ownership, strategic optimization. My name never came up. Instead, Mark spoke as if the role would naturally fall under his scope. I didn't argue. I didn't interrupt. I just listened. That's when it clicked. I wasn't overlooked because people didn't know my value. I was overlooked because my value was already being used exactly where they wanted it. Quietly, reliably, without complication. The role I was assigned wasn't written down anywhere, but it was reinforced every time I smoothed over a problem instead of naming it. Every time I chose harmony over accuracy, every time I let someone else tell the story of my work. And once I saw that clearly, I realized something else. Roles can be accepted, or they can be outgrown, but they are rarely renegotiated out loud. The shift didn't happen in a meeting. There was no argument, no dramatic realization. It happened on an ordinary afternoon in the quiet space between tasks, when nothing demanded my attention and I could no longer distract myself with usefulness. I was reviewing a budget forecast, one I had built months earlier and updated weekly. It tracked the impact of the workflow redesign across departments. The numbers were undeniable now. What had started as a modest efficiency play had scaled into something substantial. Reduced contractor hours, faster turnaround, fewer compliance penalties. When I added it all up, the value crossed six figures, just over $120,000. I sat back and stared at the screen longer than necessary. Not because I was proud, though there was some of that, but because I realized how little anyone else understood what had actually happened. To them, this was just another successful initiative under Mark's leadership. A line item in a quarterly deck, a bullet point in a performance summary. To me, it was months of quiet decisions, trade-offs, late revisions, and relationship management. It was trust built with teams that didn't report to me. It was risk I had absorbed so others wouldn't have to. And none of that had my name on it. For the first time, I allowed myself to ask a question I had been avoiding. If I left tomorrow, what would people say I did here? The answer unsettled me. They would say I was helpful, reliable, supportive. They would not say I led something transformative. They would not say I changed how the company operated. They would not say I created value at scale, because that story had already been assigned to someone else. I closed the spreadsheet and didn't open another file for a while. I just sat there, listening to the hum of the office, watching people move past my desk with purpose. I realized how much of my identity had been tied to being needed and how little of it was tied to being recognized. That was the moment something shifted. Not into anger, into clarity. I saw suddenly that my silence hadn't been neutral. It had been interpreted. Every time I let a misattribution slide, it reinforced the belief that I was comfortable in the background. Every time I chose patience over precision, I taught people what I would tolerate, and they had learned well. What changed that day wasn't my behavior outwardly. I didn't confront Mark. I didn't send an email correcting the record. I didn't announce the value I'd created. I simply stopped assuming that fairness would emerge on its own. I began to observe instead of absorb. I paid closer attention to how information flowed, who spoke in meetings versus who prepared the material, how decisions were justified after the fact, which metrics were highlighted, and which were quietly ignored. I noticed how Mark positioned himself as the origin of ideas, even when he was really the narrator of outcomes. And I noticed something else. He assumed I would always be there. There was a casual certainty in how he delegated, how he spoke about future plans that involved my work without involving me in the planning. He didn't ask if I wanted to take on more responsibility. He assumed I would, because I always had. That assumption, I realized, was my leverage. Not because I wanted to punish it, but because it revealed dependency. From that day forward, my silence changed texture. It was no longer about avoiding conflict, it became about gathering signals. I stopped volunteering fixes before problems were fully visible. I documented decisions more carefully. I kept copies of drafts, timelines, and approvals. Not to build a case, at least not consciously, but to understand the system I was operating within. I also began asking different questions in one-on-ones, not accusatory ones, clarifying ones. How will this be communicated upward? Who will be presenting this? What does success look like from leadership's perspective? Mark answered easily, without suspicion. He had no reason to be guarded. From his point of view, nothing had changed. I was still calm, still cooperative, still quiet. What he didn't see was that I had stopped measuring my success by how smoothly things ran. I was now measuring it by how clearly reality was recorded. The shift wasn't visible to anyone else, but inside the narrative had cracked. And once that happens, you can't unsee the shape of the story you're actually in. You can only decide how it ends. After that day, I didn't become louder. I became more deliberate. From the outside, nothing about me changed. I still arrived early, still answered questions promptly, still delivered what was asked of me. That consistency was important. It preserved the assumptions people had already made, that I was steady, agreeable, and unlikely to disrupt the flow. But internally, silence stopped being a default and became a decision. I began choosing when not to speak, rather than simply staying quiet out of habit. That distinction matters. Passive silence is easy to overlook. Intentional silence creates space, and space reveals things. In meetings, I noticed how often Mark filled gaps with confident summaries. If a question arose that touched on my work, he would answer quickly, sometimes accurately, sometimes loosely, before I would jump in to refine or correct. Now, I let the room sit with his version. Not to set him up, but to see how far the narrative drifted when unexamined. What I observed was telling. The more I refrained from supplementing his explanations, the more he embellished, not maliciously, almost unconsciously. He believed the story he was telling because it had never been challenged. And because I didn't challenge it, others assumed it was complete. Silence in that context was interpreted as agreement. I also stopped preemptively solving problems. When someone brought me an issue that wasn't yet urgent, I asked clarifying questions instead of immediately offering solutions. What's the timeline? Who's accountable? What happens if we don't intervene yet? This wasn't an obstruction, it was a restraint, and restraint changed the dynamics. Small delays began surfacing in places I used to quietly patch over. Nothing catastrophic, just enough friction to make processes visible. People started asking more questions upstream. Mark found himself needing to explain details he had previously delegated to me without thinking. Still, no one suspected anything. Because silence, when you've trained people to expect it, reads as compliance. They don't see it as strategic, they see it as more of the same. I also became meticulous about documentation, not just formal reports, but decision logs, email follow ups summarizing conversations, version histories with timestamps. I framed these as efficiency tools, which they were, but they also created a parallel record of how work actually moved through the organization. Mark appreciated this. He liked having clean artifacts to forward. He didn't object when my name appeared in the body of a document as long as the narrative framing remained his, and I didn't insist otherwise. Yet, what surprised me was how much people revealed when they believed you weren't a threat. Colleagues spoke freely around me. They vented about pressure, about leadership expectations, about how certain stories were massaged for executive consumption. I listened. I didn't comment. Trust flows easily toward those who don't compete for airtime. Meanwhile, Mark grew more confident. The success of the project elevated his standing. He began positioning himself for a larger role, speaking openly about future initiatives that built on his work. He included me in execution planning, but not in strategic conversations about what came next. And I let that happen. Because every time he assumed my silence meant comfort, he gave me more clarity about how replaceable he thought I was, and how indispensable I actually had become. There's a misconception that power comes from being seen. Sometimes it comes from being underestimated. When people stop monitoring you closely, they stop managing their exposure around you. They assume alignment. They assume loyalty. Silence encourages that assumption, but silence also sharpens your perception. Without the urge to correct or impress, I could see the organization as a system where pressure accumulated, where accountability leaked, where narratives diverged from reality. I saw how much depended on invisible labor and how fragile the visible confidence really was. At no point did I feel triumphant. This wasn't a game. It was more like stepping back from a painting and finally seeing the full composition, understanding where the light was coming from and where the shadows were hiding. Silence, chosen carefully, doesn't erase you. It reveals everyone else. What they never noticed was not what I was doing, but what I had stopped doing. They didn't notice that I no longer corrected timelines in real time, that I asked for written confirmations instead of verbal agreements, that I began looping legal and finance into conversations earlier, framing it as risk awareness. They saw these as signs of maturity, not preparation. In reality, I was mapping dependencies. I started with something simple, tracing how decisions became directives. Who approved what? Who presented it? Who benefited when things went well? And who absorbed the cost when they didn't? I wasn't looking for wrongdoing. I was looking for patterns. And patterns emerged quickly. I saw how Mark relied on me as a buffer between ambition and feasibility. He would commit upward, then trust me to make it real. When I flagged constraints, he'd say, "I know you'll figure it out." It sounded like confidence. It was actually an abdication. I also noticed how much institutional memory lived with me. I remembered why certain vendors were chosen, why were some shortcuts taken, why were specific metrics emphasized and others avoided. That context wasn't documented anywhere officially. It lived in emails, side conversations, and my own notes. So I began documenting it, not dramatically, not in a way that raised alarms, just consistently. I created internal wikis, process histories, decision rationales, each framed as a knowledge-sharing initiative which leadership encouraged. Transparency, after all, is fashionable until it becomes inconvenient. At the same time, I quietly strengthened relationships across departments, not by networking upward, but laterally. Finance trusted my numbers. Legal appreciated my caution. Operations relied on my foresight. These relationships weren't visible on an org chart, but they formed a web of quiet credibility. What no one realized was that this web didn't route through Mark. When questions arose, people came to me, not for permission, but for understanding. I didn't exploit that. I simply answered honestly, neutrally, with documentation to support it. Over time, my version of events became the reference point, even if Mark remained the public face. I also became more intentional about boundaries. When asked to take on work that clearly belonged elsewhere, I asked who owned the outcome. When deadlines were unrealistic, I asked what would be deprioritized. These questions weren't confrontational, they were procedural, but they shifted responsibility back to where it belonged. The effect was subtle but cumulative. Mark began to feel more pressure, not because I challenged him, but because the system no longer absorbed his assumptions without friction. Things required explanation. Trade-offs became visible. Confidence alone stopped carrying decisions across the finish line. Still, he didn't connect this to me. Why would he? From his perspective, I was still supportive, still calm, still not claiming credit. The idea that I might be repositioning myself simply didn't occur to him. People tend not to monitor those they believe they've already categorized. What they also didn't notice was how much evidence I had access to. Every project leaves a trail. Emails, drafts, approvals, timestamps. Most people don't think about this because they assume the story will always favor them. I knew better now. I kept my records organized, not as a weapon, but as a mirror. If ever questioned, I wanted the facts to speak, not my emotions. This wasn't about exposing anyone. It was about being prepared for the moment when reality and narrative could no longer coexist comfortably. And that moment I sensed was approaching. The company announced a restructuring, new leadership, new priorities, opportunities, they said, for streamlining and strategic alignment. Those words always precede scrutiny, and scrutiny changes the value of truth. Mark seemed energized. He spoke about how his initiatives positioned the team well for the transition. He talked about scaling, about visibility, about his role in shaping the future. He assumed I would continue to support that trajectory. What he didn't see was that I was now operating on a different timeline. I had stopped assuming my future was tied to his narrative. I was no longer invested in being seen as indispensable in the same way. Instead, I was making sure that if my contribution were ever questioned or erased entirely, the record would stand on its own. There's a quiet power in being prepared without announcing it, in knowing that while others are performing, you are positioning. While they are telling stories, you are preserving facts. What they never noticed was that my silence wasn't empty. It was structured, and structure, once in place, holds longer than confidence ever does. The reveal didn't come as a rush of triumph. There was no surge of adrenaline, no sense of victory. It arrived quietly, as most realizations do, when enough pieces finally align and the picture becomes unavoidable. It happened late one evening, long after most of the office had emptied. I was organizing my documentation, not out of anxiety, but routine. I had gotten into the habit of reviewing major threads at the end of each week, making sure context wasn't lost to time. As I cross-referenced project timelines with approval chains, something stood out. Several of the decisions that underpinned the $120,000 project had never been formally approved at Mark's level. They had been assumed. In practice, that meant I had been the de facto decision-maker, operating under implied authority rather than explicit sign-off. That alone wasn't unusual. What mattered was how those decisions were later described. In executive summaries and performance reviews, Mark had framed those same choices as strategic calls he had made, calls that carried risk. Risk in leadership language is currency. You're rewarded not just for outcomes, but for the perception of having owned the uncertainty. Except the risk hadn't been his. I traced the chain further. Emails where I flagged concerns. Responses where Mark deferred. Meeting notes where I was tasked with handling specific trade-offs. All of it documented, all of it time-stamped. The narrative and the record were diverging. I sat back and let that sink in. This wasn't about credit anymore. It was about accountability. If the project were ever questioned, if someone scrutinized how decisions were made, the official story would place responsibility on Mark. But the evidence told a different truth. One where he benefited from the outcome without having borne the operational risk. That asymmetry is unstable. The private reveal was understanding that I held clarity, others didn't. Not leverage in the dramatic sense, but informational asymmetry. I knew where the story was thin, where confidence was substituting for process, where my work had quietly insulated leadership from exposure. And I knew something else. If Mark's standing depended on a version of events that couldn't withstand inspection, then his confidence in firing me or sidelining me would one day collide with reality. That realization didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel calm. I stopped asking myself whether I had been wronged and started asking a different question. What is the most honest version of events, and who is prepared to stand behind it? I didn't share this with anyone, not friends, not colleagues, not even myself fully. I just adjusted how I moved. I became even more precise. When asked to make decisions, I asked for written alignment. When Mark summarized initiatives, I followed up with documentation that clarified roles and responsibilities, framed as support, not correction. He thanked me for being thorough. He still didn't see it. The more I documented, the clearer it became that my position in the company was paradoxical. I was trusted with execution, but excluded from recognition, relied upon, but not protected. If something went wrong, I would be exposed. If it went right, I would be invisible. That is not a sustainable place to stand. Around this time, HR requested updated role descriptions as part of the restructuring. Mark asked me to draft mine. "You know what you do better than anyone," he said. So I wrote the truth. Not inflated, not modest, just accurate. Scope, impact, decision-making authority and practice, cross-functional influence, measurable outcomes. When Mark reviewed it, he hesitated. "This reads a little senior," he said lightly. "Let's soften it." I nodded, revised the language, sent it back. But I kept the original. That was the moment the private reveal crystallized. The organization was comfortable benefiting from my senior-level contribution as long as it didn't require senior-level acknowledgement. And Mark was comfortable with that imbalance as long as I remained quiet. I didn't feel anger. I felt alignment. Alignment between what I knew, what I had documented, and what I was no longer willing to accept. From that point on, the question wasn't if something would change. It was how, and whether I would choose the timing or let it be chosen for me. Once you see the structure clearly, indecision becomes its own decision. I reached a point where continuing as I was meant actively consenting to an outcome I already understood. The imbalance wasn't theoretical anymore. It was documented, predictable, and increasingly risky for me. The restructuring moved forward faster than expected. Calendars filled with alignment meetings, org charts circulated in draft form, and language like efficiency and streamlining appeared in every subject line. These processes are never neutral. There are moments when narratives harden into policy. I knew I had options. I listed them carefully, the way I approach most things. Option 1. Speak up internally. Request formal recognition. Ask for clarity on role and authority. Push politely for the title and scope that matched my contribution. This option appealed to my sense of fairness. It also assumed good faith and institutional memory, two things I had already learned not to rely on. Option 2, leave quietly, find another role elsewhere. Let the story remain intact and take my experience with me. Clean, low friction, respectable. This option protected my energy, but it also meant walking away from the truth I had preserved. It meant allowing the misattribution to solidify unchallenged. Option 3, wait. Not passively, but strategically. Allow the system to proceed on its current assumptions. Let decisions be made with an incomplete understanding. Stay present, visible enough to be relied on, invisible enough to avoid scrutiny. And when the moment arrived, when accountability was required, ensure that the record spoke for itself. This option was irreversible. Once chosen, it meant accepting whatever consequences followed, including the possibility that I would be blamed before I was believed. I sat with that for a long time. The temptation to resolve things cleanly, to force clarity through conversation, was strong. But every precedent I'd observed suggested that clarity offered too early simply allowed others to adjust their story. The longer the narrative remained unchallenged, the more fragile it became. I also considered my own limits. I wasn't interested in revenge. I didn't want to embarrass anyone. I wanted alignment between reality and responsibility, and I wanted to exit this chapter of my life without carrying resentment forward. That narrowed the field. The decision point wasn't about winning, it was about choosing the path that required the least distortion of truth. I chose to wait. Not indefinitely, with intention. I stopped seeking reassurance. I stopped trying to read Mark's moods or anticipate his needs. I focused instead on maintaining impeccable records and clear communication. If asked to confirm something, I confirmed it in writing. If excluded from a conversation that affected my work, I followed up with a summary and clarifying questions. Mark began to grow distant, not overtly, but subtly. Fewer check-ins, less context shared. I recognized the shift immediately. It often precedes a decision made elsewhere, a decision you're not meant to influence. The confirmation came in the form of a calendar invite, a short meeting with HR and Mark. No agenda, 30 minutes. I didn't feel surprised. I felt ready. The night before, I reviewed my documentation, not to rehearse an argument, but to ground myself in facts. I reminded myself that whatever happened next didn't define my worth. It would simply reveal how the system resolved tension. The meeting was calm, polite, procedural. Mark spoke about organizational changes and role realignment. HR nodded. The language was careful, impersonal. My position, they explained, was being eliminated. Not due to performance, my contributions were valued, but due to shifting priorities. I listened. I asked clarifying questions. I took notes. When it was over, Mark said, "I hope you understand. This wasn't an easy decision." I believed him. That didn't make it right. As I left the room, I felt an unexpected sense of relief. The waiting was over. The choice had been made by them. Now it was my turn to decide what happened next. Because the moment you're no longer protecting a system that didn't protect you, the truth becomes remarkably easy to carry. The day after the meeting, I didn't tell anyone I'd been fired. Not immediately. I logged in, answered a few messages, and closed out tasks that were still assigned to me. I wasn't trying to be a martyr or prove anything. I just wanted to leave the system in the exact state it expected me to be in. Stable, predictable, quiet. HR had outlined the offboarding process, 2 weeks of transition support, documentation handover, a neutral reference, everything polite, everything designed to move forward without friction. I agreed to all of it. What I didn't do was correct the assumptions underneath it. Mark assumed I would transfer knowledge generously the way I always had. He assumed I would summarize context verbally, smooth over gaps, and make sure nothing broke once I was gone. He assumed continuity, and I didn't challenge that assumption. Instead, I followed the process precisely. I shared documentation that already existed. I pointed to wikis and decision logs. I answered questions with references rather than explanations. When asked for clarification, I asked whether the answer already existed in the record, and if not, whether someone wanted to formalize it. This wasn't an obstruction, it was alignment. I noticed how often people asked me things that weren't written anywhere else. Not because they were lazy, but because I had always been the repository, the interpreter, the bridge between intention and execution. Now, I simply become a mirror. What was the rationale behind this vendor choice? It's outlined in the approval thread from March 12th. Can you explain why this metric was prioritized? That decision was discussed in the Q2 planning notes. Each response was accurate, complete, and slightly unsettling. The silence began to shift. People realized how much lived in my head only when they had to reconstruct it themselves. Meetings ran longer. Follow-ups multiplied. Mark started asking more pointed questions, not accusatory, just strained. "Is there anything else we should know?" he asked once. I paused, genuinely considering it. "No," I said. "Everything relevant is documented." That was true. What wasn't documented was the intuition, the judgment calls, the relationships I had managed quietly to prevent escalation, the small interventions that kept things from becoming problems. Those things don't transfer cleanly. As my last day approached, Mark grew more anxious. He scheduled extra check-ins, asked for verbal walkthroughs, and suggested we sync one last time. I kept everything in writing. I wasn't withholding. I was honoring the system as it had always been presented to me, one that valued records over recognition. On my final afternoon, I returned my laptop and badge. HR thanked me for my professionalism. Mark shook my hand. "Take care," he said, "and good luck." I meant it when I said the same to him. What happened next didn't happen immediately. That's important. There was no explosion, no sudden collapse, just a slow emergence of gaps that had been filled so seamlessly no one realized they were there. Processes that technically existed but lacked coherence. Decisions that required judgment without context. Questions began to circulate. Who owned what? Why had this been done this way? When had that assumption been validated? Mark did his best to answer. Sometimes he could. Sometimes he couldn't. When he reached for confidence, it didn't always land. Because confidence without depth feels different when tested. Meanwhile, I moved on. I took time before starting anything new. I reviewed the experience honestly, without villainizing anyone. I updated my portfolio with outcomes I could substantiate. I spoke to recruiters with clarity, not defensiveness. When asked why I left, I said the truth. My role had evolved beyond its title, and I let the record speak where my voice no longer needed to. Silence, I learned, doesn't end when you leave a place. Sometimes it begins to echo. The consequences didn't announce themselves. They never do. At first, everything looked fine. The dashboard still updated, the meeting still happened, the language stayed optimistic. From the outside, the system appeared intact, because systems are designed to preserve appearances long after substance has shifted. But pressure has a way of finding the weakest seams. A few weeks after I left, I received my first message. It was from someone in operations, not a close friend, just a former collaborator. "Hey, quick question," it read. "Do you remember why we structured the approval flow this way?" I replied politely, pointing them to the documentation. "Oh," they said after a pause. "Right, I guess we're still trying to interpret that." More messages followed: finance, compliance, product, each asking for context that technically existed but practically required interpretation. I answered when appropriate, always referencing what had already been written, never adding color, never speculating. Inside the company, the friction was growing. Decisions that once moved smoothly now stall. Meetings stretched longer, circling the same questions without resolution. Mark began to feel it first, not as failure, but as drag. The kind that makes you look less decisive without ever being able to explain why. Leadership noticed. They asked for updates, requested clarity, wanted to understand why timelines were slipping on initiatives that were supposed to be extensions of prior success. Mark spoke confidently, but the confidence no longer carried the same weight. When pressed for detail, he deferred to systems, to teams, to execution complexity. The same complexity I had quietly absorbed for years. What changed now was visibility. Without a buffer, issues surfaced earlier and louder. The narrative of seamless leadership began to crack, not catastrophically, but persistently, enough to invite scrutiny, enough to make people revisit assumptions. Someone pulled the old project documentation, not to question it, but to replicate its success. That's when the questions sharpened. Why were certain decisions made without formal approval? Who had evaluated the risk trade-offs? Where was the escalation path documented? The answers existed, but they didn't align with the story leadership had been telling. Mark found himself in a difficult position. To claim ownership now meant owning decisions he hadn't fully understood at the time. To distance himself meant admitting that the work had been driven elsewhere. Neither option was comfortable. And comfort is what organizations prioritize until they can't. I wasn't there to witness this directly. I heard it in fragments, in careful language, in the tone of messages that started with, "I don't want to put you in an awkward position, but..." I never felt tempted to intervene. This wasn't vindication, it was inevitable. When a system relies too heavily on unacknowledged labor, removing that labor exposes the dependency, not dramatically, but unmistakably. Like removing a support beam that was never labeled as structural. Mark's confidence shifted into defensiveness. He began over-explaining, over-documenting, trying to retroactively align the record with the narrative. But documentation created after the fact has a different texture. It lacks the quiet certainty of decisions made in real time. Leadership sensed the difference. Performance reviews became more pointed, questions are more specific. The room is less forgiving, and still no one said my name. Not publicly, but privately I knew it was being said. Not as blame, but as reference. Daniel used to handle this. Didn't Daniel have context on that? Maybe we should check how Daniel structured it. I wasn't present, but I was no longer invisible. The consequences had begun. Not because I demanded recognition, but because the absence of truth is hard to maintain once pressure is applied. And pressure was building. By the time the urgency became obvious, the window for quiet correction had already closed. What started as operational friction had turned into something harder to contain: credibility drift. The kind that doesn't trigger alarms but shows up in body language, in the way executives stop nodding automatically, in the follow-up emails that ask for just a bit more detail, in the silence after a confident statement that would once have ended the discussion. Mark tried to regain control the only way he knew how, by tightening his grip on the narrative. He scheduled more meetings, produced longer decks, spoke with greater certainty. But the problem wasn't a lack of confidence. It was a lack of alignment between confidence and evidence. People had begun checking, not aggressively, not skeptically, just carefully. When a senior leader asked how a particular risk had been mitigated in the original $120,000 project, Mark gave an answer that sounded right, but wasn't precise. Someone from compliance followed up with documentation. The dates didn't line up. The approvals didn't match the sequence being described. No one accused him of anything. They didn't need to. Confusion is often more damaging than confrontation. It invites review, and review invites history. Mark attempted to reconstruct context, pulling from old emails, summarizing past decisions, reaching out to people who had once deferred to me. But context reconstructed under pressure never carries the same authority as context preserved intentionally. The more he tried to fix it, the clearer it became that he hadn't owned the depth of the work he'd been credited for. Meanwhile, leadership wanted reassurance. They asked whether similar projects could be replicated with the same efficiency, whether the decision framework could be standardized, whether the risk appetite had been formally approved or merely assumed. Each question narrowed the margin for narrative flexibility. Mark began reaching out to me more directly. The messages were careful, polite, almost nostalgic. "Hope you're doing well. Quick question, do you recall why we handled X that way?" Trying to provide some background, any insight would help. I responded sparingly, always factually, always referencing what already existed. "I believe that's covered in the March 12th thread. The rationale was documented in the planning notes. I don't have additional context beyond what's in the record." I wasn't withholding. I was respecting boundaries. At some point, he stopped asking. Not because he had everything he needed, but because he understood something had shifted. The leverage he once assumed was gone. The informal access, the unspoken safety net. It was too late to rebuild it. Inside the company, the tone changed. Leadership didn't need to assign blame to recognize misalignment. They adjusted the scope, reduced expectations, reframed success. Mark's initiatives were no longer positioned as templates, but as exceptions. His authority hadn't vanished, but it had narrowed. And the most difficult part for him wasn't the scrutiny. It was the realization that the person he had assumed would always absorb complexity had done so by choice, not obligation. Once that choice was withdrawn, the structure he relied on revealed its fragility. I felt no satisfaction watching this unfold. only a quiet confirmation that systems eventually reflect how they've been treated. When contribution is consistently separated from credit, reality waits patiently for a moment when it no longer has to. That moment had arrived. By the time leadership fully understood the gap between narrative and execution, there was nothing to fix, only lessons to absorb. And some lessons arrived too late to benefit the people who need them most. The confrontation, when it finally came, was almost anticlimactic. Mark reached out to me months after I'd left, not through corporate channels, but directly, a short message, neutral tone. Would you be open to a quick call? I agreed. There was no reason not to. When his face appeared on the screen, he looked tired. Not defeated, just strained. The confidence was still there, but it had edges now. He started with small talk, asked how I was settling in, mentioned the weather, the market, and mutual acquaintances. Then he paused. I want to be honest, he said. Things have been more complicated than expected since you left. I nodded. I didn't fill the silence. He continued, carefully. He talked about the restructuring, the pressure from leadership, and the difficulty of maintaining momentum. He didn't accuse. He didn't apologize. He framed it as shared history, shared effort. Finally, he said what he'd come to say. I think there's been some misunderstanding about how that project was positioned. There it was. Not an admission, not a denial, a reframing attempt. I listened. Let him finish. When it was my turn, I spoke slowly, evenly. There's no misunderstanding on my side, I said. I know exactly what I worked on, and I know how it was presented. He shifted in his chair. I never meant to take credit from you, he said quickly. That was never my intention. I believe that too. I don't think you set out to, I replied, but intention and outcome aren't the same thing. The conversation stayed calm. There was no raised voice, no accusation. I didn't list grievances or recite timelines. I didn't need to. The facts existed independently of my emotions. He asked, finally, is there anything I can do to help clarify things? It was a sincere question. I considered it. No, I said. What's clear is already clear. Anything added now would look like a revision. He exhaled, slowly, as if he'd been holding his breath. I wish we'd talked sooner, he said. So do I replied. And I meant it, not because I wanted a different outcome, but because earlier honesty might have changed the shape of things for both of us. The call ended without resolution, no agreement, no closure in the traditional sense, but something had been acknowledged. Not publicly, not formally, privately. And that was enough. I hung up feeling lighter, not vindicated, but unburdened. I hadn't needed to defend myself or correct the record. The truth had already done its work. Quietly. I'm not the person I was when this story began, but I'm also not someone entirely new. What changed wasn't my temperament or my values. It was my understanding of how those values function in the real world. For a long time, I believed that integrity meant endurance, that staying calm, being reliable, and letting results speak would eventually lead to alignment. I thought patience was neutral. That silence preserved dignity. Now I understand that silence is never neutral. It teaches people what you'll accept. It shapes the roles you're given. And if left unexamined, it can slowly trade clarity for comfort. I still work quietly. I still prefer substance over spectacle. But I no longer confuse invisibility with virtue. I don't assume that fairness will surface on its own timeline. I participate in the narrative now, not loudly, not aggressively, but deliberately. In my current role, expectations are explicit. Authority is documented. Decisions have names attached to them. When something succeeds, the ownership is clear. When something struggles, accountability is shared. Not because the culture is perfect, but because I insist on alignment before I commit my energy. That insistence doesn't come with anger. It comes with calm questions. How will this be represented? Who is responsible for the outcome? What record will reflect this decision? These questions don't threaten people. They orient them. And the right environments welcome them. I've also become more attentive to people who remind me of who I used to be, the ones who carry weight quietly, who solves problems before they're visible, those who believe that being useful is the same as being valued. When I see them, I don't tell them to speak up or demand credit. That advice rarely lands well. Instead, I ask them how their work is being framed and whether that framing matches reality. Sometimes, just asking that question is enough to create a shift. I don't harbor bitterness toward Mark. He operated within incentives that rewarded confidence over accuracy, visibility over contribution. He wasn't unique, he was normal, and that's what made the experience instructive. What I gained wasn't revenge or recognition. It was precision. Precision about where I invest myself. Precision about what I document. Precision about the difference between being trusted and being protected. I no longer confuse proximity to power with power itself. I don't assume that access equals influence. And I don't wait for moments of crisis to understand where leverage lives. Quiet dominance, I've learned, isn't about outmaneuvering others. It's about refusing to abandon truth, especially when doing so would be convenient. I'm still calm, still reflective, still understated, but I am no longer invisible. If there's a single lesson this story leaves behind, it's this. Silence is never empty. It is always interpreted, and over time it becomes evidence, either of alignment or of consent. For years, I believed that staying quiet was the ethical choice, not correcting people, not asserting ownership, and not disrupting momentum was a form of professionalism. I told myself I was being patient, principled, and mature. What I was really doing was outsourcing the story of my work to people whose incentives were not aligned with the truth. That doesn't make them evil, it makes them human. Organizations don't reward contribution automatically. They reward narratives that survive pressure. If you don't participate in shaping that narrative, someone else will, often without realizing they're overriding you. The danger isn't having your work taken from you. The danger is slowly accepting a role that requires you to disappear in order to function. What saved me wasn't confrontation. It wasn't aggression. It wasn't revenge. It was clarity about how systems actually work, about where leverage really lives, and about the quiet cost of being endlessly reasonable. I didn't win by exposing anyone. I won by stopping my own erasure, by documenting instead of arguing, by observing instead of reacting, by letting reality stand long enough that it no longer needed my voice to defend it. And when the moment came, when silence was no longer protection but preparation, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't rewrite history. I simply stepped out of a structure that depended on my invisibility to survive. That's what quiet dominance looks like in real life. Not dominance over people, but dominance over your own narrative, over your boundaries, over the conditions under which you give your best work. If you take anything from this story, let it be this question, not for confrontation, not for drama, but for honesty. In your own life, where have you mistaken silence for strength, and what would change if you chose clarity instead? If this story resonated with you, I'd really like to hear your thoughts. Have you ever been underestimated because you stayed quiet? Or have you ever realized too late that someone else was telling the story of your work? Share your experience in the comments. Sometimes naming it is the first step toward reclaiming it.